It was a spring day in Chicago, and I was in my car at a traffic light stopped, and I glanced at the car next to me and noticed that the woman driving the car was looking at me with the strangest expression on her face. Didn't know what to think of it. The light turned green, but before I could put my foot on the accelerator, suddenly a weighted paper flew through the window, hit me on the cheek, and bounced off. I was a bit startled, so I pulled my car over and I picked up this weighted paper. Would you like to guess what it was? It was an evangelistic tract. And then I realized why she had such an intense expression on her face. What she was thinking was, how far do I have to throw this so that I can hit that woman in the next car with the gospel? Now, I'm sure this woman loved the Lord. I am sure she sincerely wanted to share her faith and the gospel, but torpedo evangelism is not what I see practiced in the Bible. I should never admit this, but I was so tempted to drive up right next to her and throw a paper at her that said, when she opened it, "Read my book on evangelism." You need help. Now, obviously, there are a few things this woman didn't understand about effective evangelism. Now, in another session, we learned how important it is, if we're going to be effective in our witness, that we love, that we listen, that we try to understand where people are coming from. But here are two other things that I think will really help you. The first is, there is a process involved in evangelism, and it's in 3 stages. The first is, we need to learn how to cultivate curiosity, to provoke interest in the gospel. The second stage is then we share the message. Once we've cultivated curiosity, people are going to be much more open to wanting to hear. And then thirdly, at the right Spirit-led time, we need to invite a response. The second thing that I think is very helpful in understanding evangelism, God has given us His resources to be effective witnesses, His power, His truth, and His love. Now, our tendency is to only rely on one, but God has given us all 3. So we need to depend upon God's power, declare God's truth, and display God's love. Now, I want to look at this first stage. How can we cultivate curiosity? Have you ever noticed how Jesus and Paul spoke to those who were outside the fold? Did they begin by preaching a sermon? No. What you see them doing is always cultivating curiosity in the listener in order to get their attention so they would want to hear more about what they had to say. I really think this stage of cultivating curiosity is the most neglected and overlooked in the whole process of evangelism. The goal in this stage of cultivating curiosity is really quite simple. It's having a positive encounter with a skeptic and sparking interest in the gospel. It's sparking curiosity so they will want to explore more. Because if we're not doing that, if we're not trying to cultivate their curiosity, they're not going to be interested in what we have to say. So we need to learn how to do that. So what I want to look at in this talk is, how do we cultivate curiosity with the resources that God has given us? How do we cultivate curiosity? By depending on God's power, declaring His truth, and displaying His love. Let's take the first one. How do we cultivate curiosity? By depending on God's power. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 4:20, "For the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power." Now that means that we must not be satisfied with what we can do from human strength. Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. That is why prayer is such an invaluable tool in evangelism. That means, therefore, we need to pray for ourselves. It is a mystery. But prayer releases God's Spirit and fills us with a power and an authority from God that we did not have before we prayed. Becoming an effective witness is always going to begin on your knees, not first on your feet. Secondly, we need to learn how to pray for our seeker friends. Prayer can open blind eyes and create an interest in Christ that wasn't there before. Unbelief is primarily a spiritual problem. And so we need to be reflecting on our friend, but also asking God and saying, Lord, help me to understand what's really blocking their faith. Is it an intellectual issue? Or is it pain from their past? Very different approaches depending on where their unbelief is coming from. Is it a fear of giving up control? Are they afraid of what their friends might say? In other words, we just don't pray, dear Lord, save Sally, and that's an end of it. We need to pray with much greater discernment and asking God to help us understand. We also can pray with them, with our unbelieving friends. I didn't used to do this in the past, but now if they share a problem, and if I feel led by the Lord, I might say, I know you're not sure what you believe, but you know that I really do believe in God, and I believe the Bible teaches us that God loves us and really cares about us. Would you mind if I ask God right now to help you with this problem? Do you know, I can't think of a single time when I've been turned down with that request. And it might also help them to consider that God is personal and he takes a personal interest in them. But you have to be led of the Lord. This isn't something I do with everyone. And lastly, in terms of prayer, we need to prepare ourselves spiritually. The Bible tells us that we are to be prepared for spiritual battle. And that is very true when we engage in evangelism. In Ephesians, we're told, put on the whole armor of God. Jesus told his disciples who couldn't understand why they weren't able to help a troubled man, Jesus says that can only come out by prayer and fasting. So we need to be willing to go that extra mile, particularly in prayer when we see resistance and we're running into roadblocks. And prayer and fasting should be a part of our lives anyway, not just in regards to evangelism. So that's the first. We cultivate curiosity by depending on God's power. How do we cultivate curiosity? Through truth. All right, this approach is appealing to reason. It's seeking to understand what are their intellectual defenses against faith. Try to identify what are their points of resistance to Christianity. And then try, hopefully, to remove some of their barriers to faith. Now, how do we do that? How do we go about that? Well, first, you need to investigate. You need to know who you're talking to. We don't pry, but we need to learn how to ask gentle questions to help us understand a little better. What is their background? What's their spiritual background? What kind of questions do they have about faith? Why are they resistant? Where are they resistant? The more you understand about your friend's perspective and questions on life, the more you're going to see the connection points to the gospel. So first you have to investigate. Secondly, you need to stimulate. You need to stimulate their interest in faith. Now, Jesus was a master of sparking curiosity. Do you remember when he was speaking to the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4? And he broke through the cultural barriers between men and women, and he ignored the racial division between Jew and Samaritan simply by asking for a cup of water. That was the first thing he did to spark her curiosity, was an action. And boy, did that action spark her curiosity. Then Jesus threw out a very provocative statement. He said, of course, if you had asked me, I would have given you living water. And then it's almost as if, but never mind. And she goes, living water? You can't give me living water. He said, why is that? She goes, you don't have a bucket. Very pragmatic woman. Oh, he says, I don't need a bucket, because the living water that I give, it will well up into eternal life. Why, you'd never even have to come back here and draw. What is he doing? Unabashedly arousing her curiosity, trying to get her attention. Now, the key to do this properly, to spark curiosity, is never to manipulate. Big difference between manipulation and cultivating curiosity. So when she says, okay, give me this water, Jesus knows two things. He's got her attention, but he also knows that she doesn't really understand, fully at least, his message. At that point, he very sensitively redirects the conversation to her personal troubles to help her understand why she needs this water so desperately that he has to offer. And then he reveals more about who he is. So the point here is that we need to get a sense of who the person is that we really are seeking to be a witness to. Discover and understand their barriers to face, and then seek to remove those barriers if possible. Now, let me give you an example of this principle. Years ago, I was flying from Portland, Oregon, where I did student ministry for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, to Chicago. A man sat down next to me, and I soon learned he was a professor at a very respected university. We had a wonderful conversation. We talked about all kinds of things until he asked me what I did for a living. And he said, now, Becky, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm in Christian work. And he said, that's impossible. I said, why? He said, you look normal. I said, well, no, really, that's what I do. And he goes, but you seemed so intelligent. Have you ever had a conversation with someone and it goes fine until they find out you're religious? Then everything changes. That's exactly what happened here. His whole approach changed. And he said with some condescension, well, what is the name of your little organization? And I said, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Now, if you don't live in the States, perhaps you don't know that the word varsity in America has definite athletic associations, which I'd frankly forgotten. He then looked at me with this puzzled expression. He said, well, excuse me, but you just don't look like a Christian athlete. Thinking he was kidding, I said, yes, well, I play basketball for Jesus. Are you ready for this? He believed me. And he said, well, I'm sure it must be very rewarding. Like, isn't that what you say, to little religious types? I was so tempted to play along with his sort of stereotype of what he thought I'd be like. I was so tempted to say, oh, yes, playing basketball for Jesus, it's such a blessing. We never lose a game. I said, well, no, actually, that was a little joke. Sometimes we make jokes. I said, well, you asked me if my work is rewarding. That's not the word that comes to my mind. I would say my work is unbelievably intriguing. He said, intriguing? All right, why is it intriguing? Now, Why did I say this? What's going on? What did Jesus say? Jesus said he's calling us to be fishers of men, not hunters of men. Big difference. So if you're going to be fishers of men, fishers of women, you need to throw out bait. What kind of bait was I throwing out? Provocative language. My work is very intriguing. Now, what else do you have to do when you're speaking to somebody? Ask yourself, what is that person's greatest point of resistance to Christianity? And then you mention it before they do. Now, it is so obvious. He was a very, very bright academic. What would be his point of resistance? There is no evidence for faith. Yeah, it's naive. There is no evidence. Then you mention their resistance before they do. And he said, well, all right, why is your work so intriguing? I said, I work with very bright Christian students who wrestle every day with the question, how do I know it's true? How do I know I'm not creating my own kind of reality? How do I know it's true? He said, you aren't going to believe this. Those questions were going through my mind. I said, really? Oh. And he goes, all right, I want to know, how do you know it's true? Now, I had investigated first, and what did I find out? He was an historian. He was a professor of history. So as I was stimulating his curiosity, I knew that what he would really be interested in is what we would call historical apologetics. So he said, how do you know it's true? So I talked a bit about, is the Bible historically reliable, and all different kinds of historical issues. We talked about that for quite a while. Then he said, Becky, there's something about me that you don't know. What you don't know is that I was actually raised in a Christian home. He said, but the more you and I have talked, the more I have realized as a child, I blindly accepted all of this. But now I'm starting to realize as an adult, I've blindly rejected all of this. And for the sake of intellectual integrity, I need to know what it is I've rejected and why. So I tell you what I'm going to do. When I get home, I'm going to buy a Bible. I'm going to start reading the New Testament. So the next time I meet you seated on a plane, I'm going to be able to prove to you why I know it is not true. That's what he thinks. Do you know how many people have been profoundly converted because they read the Bible in order to prove it wasn't true and were profoundly convinced? I am one of them. Now, as we kept talking, he said, I got to tell you what strikes me the most about you. You seem to be a woman of hope and not despair. And I'd like to know why. And at that point, there was no need to investigate. There was no need to stimulate. I was now free to relate the hope that is within me. And I shared with him the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we can arouse curiosity by depending upon God's power. We can arouse curiosity by using and depending on God's truth. And thirdly, we cultivate curiosity through God's love. People have amazing radar in this area. They can tell whether we think of them as evangelistic projects or if we really care about them as a person. Demonstrating Christ's love is the greatest apologetic before an unbelieving, skeptical world. Nothing touches the hearts of people more. So how do we do that? Well, I've said this before. We listen. We began by listening, asking questions, discovering their longings, their hopes. We invite them to do things together, socially, things that they enjoy and we enjoy. We show up for things that really matter to them. Let me tell you another thing. We need to verbalize the good that we see in them. Remember when Jesus said, Nathanael, now there is a man in whom there is no guile, and he opened up like a flower. Remember doing a conference and a woman, quite a character. She was from the deep south of America and older. And she had been to one of our conferences, and she said to me afterwards, I am so convicted because I honestly, I just don't care for people who aren't Christians. I'm very judgmental. I don't like the way they dress. I don't like this. I don't like that. And I've been so convicted that I need to ask God to give me far more love for people who don't know him. But now you're telling me I have to even identify the good I see. And she said, so I'm going to really try. Well, I saw her a little bit later, and she told me she had gotten on a bus, and a guy got on the bus with, and it was young, a teenager, and, hair out to here, tattoos over his entire body. A mohawk. I think he had a mohawk. And she said, she has a real southern drawl, because she's from the deep south. And she said, he got on the bus, and I said to myself, I bet that boy's on drugs. He comes over and sits down right next to her. And she was like, immediately, feeling judgmental and angry. And then went, oh, no, what did I just learn? I've got to be able to love people with the love of Christ and ask God to show me if there's anything good. And she goes, oh, Lord, help me. I don't see one good thing. And then she said, and then I had it. She said, I looked at him and I said, son, I just want to congratulate you because I noticed all your tattoos are spelled correctly. Well, it's a start. Now, besides learning how to spark curiosity, the other thing I always hear from Christians is, how do you raise the topic of faith? I have no idea. How do you go from a natural conversation to a spiritual conversation without feeling like you've dropped an A-bomb into the conversation? How do you do this? How do we raise the topic of faith? The answer is by asking good questions. Now, first I want to say something about asking questions. It is a biblical model. There are two primary ways in the Bible that God communicates with people. He asks questions and he tells stories. We give answers and preach sermons. Now, who do you think is the better communicator? Questions are effective because they can be used in a non-threatening way, and they often elicit a question back, and most people are genuinely moved that we want to know more about who they are. Questions is a biblical model. But is it manipulative to use questions so they'll want to explore who Jesus is? After all, we hear our secular friends often say, I just accept people where they are. I have no desire to change them at all. Now, that sounds loving, but why do they say this? Because we live in a culture that doesn't believe in truth. So why suggest there's a better way when no way is a way of truth? So yes, we do want people to become Christians. Why? Because knowing Jesus Christ is absolutely the best thing that can ever happen to anyone ever. And because we love Jesus, we want him to receive the praise that he so richly deserves. And because God commands us that we are to share our faith. Now, let me tell you one thing that's really freed me in this area, this fear of, do I have a hidden agenda? Is that wrong, etc. What has freed me is realizing no one has the power to make anyone a Christian. No one has that power. So if somebody asks me, Becky, are you trying to make me become a Christian? I can honestly say, and I have said it, I don't have that kind of power. That is between you and God. But if you're asking me, do I want you to become a Christian? Oh, yes, I do. For two reasons. One, I really care about you. And two, I think it's the most wonderful thing that could ever happen to anyone. But remember, our questions won't be effective unless we genuinely care for people. In other words, we don't feign an interest with somebody just so we can really slip in the gospel. That approach will always backfire. We have to genuinely, sincerely care about them as a whole person. Now, is there a way then to take their interests, their passions, what they're really interested in, and without being manipulative to arouse their curiosity in faith. There is. Now, I want you to take a look at a model, this model that, that you see on the screen. And it's what I call concentric circle models. And it really shows you how any good conversation works. Now, if you look at the outer rim of the conversation, it's a general interest question. The way any conversation goes is that when we're interested in somebody, we want to start asking questions. What they do for a living, how many children they have, what they study at university, whatever it is, a general interest. When you're really interested in somebody, it moves to the next layer, and that is specific interest. What, how, why? Now, let me tell you something. These two areas, nobody needs to be taught this. Everybody does this. This is what makes a good conversation, is that if we're interested in people, it is absolutely the most easy and logical thing to do. We don't need to learn how to do it. What we do need to learn how and need some help with is the third layer, and then the fourth in the center. And the third circle is the issue question. Now, what is that? It is asking a reflective question about their area of interest. It's a question that causes them to reflect about what they believe. And then in the middle is the God question. We need to ask a spiritual question, a God question. Now, we usually think, oh, that is the hardest. I have no idea how to ask a God question. The truth is, if you have a good issue question, the God question usually follows fairly easily. Now, I need to say something about this, and that is conversations are much more fluid than what I'm doing right here. It may very well be when you're getting to know somebody, you might spend a lot of time on general interest and specific interest before you get to an issue question or a God question. But at some point, to move from the natural to a spiritual, it will really help you if you learn how to ask an issue question and a God question. But in order for me to teach this, I sort of have to take it layer by layer. So it may seem a bit stilted, but in real life, conversation is actually quite fluid. So the last thing I want you to do is to go learn this sort of, this model, but then go and talk to somebody and then going, like you're driving a car with gear shifts. It's not like, here's my issue question. Now we're heading for the God question. Watch out. That's not how you do this. Let me give you some examples. We were doing a conference, and there was a group of doctors who had come, and I had been asking them to write 4 questions following that model that pertain to someone they were sharing the gospel with. So these doctors wrote 4 questions that they would have asked to a doctor they just met. Now, here's an example of this. The general question: what made you go into medicine? Specific: what's your specialty? Why did you choose it? What are some of the challenges? Issue question. Now, see, pay attention to this. This is when you take what they're interested in, but you ask an issue question that will make them reflect on their beliefs already. Issue question: how do you give hope to patients who are terminal? How do you give hope to patients who are dying? God question: what hope would it give if we knew that God is real and there is a life beyond this one? Now, you could use, I thought the questions were really good, and you could use this to someone whose friend is seriously ill. Couldn't we use those same kind of questions? What hope can we give? What hope could you give to your friend whose fate might be facing death? What difference would it make to know that God is real and there's a life beyond this one? I mean, this could apply to many things. Secondly, an artist example. I was speaking to a student, And I asked her what she was studying at the university, and she said art. Then the specific questions were, why did you choose art? What's your art form? Why do you love that expression of art so much? The issue question, since you're going to be making a living out of creating beauty, what draws you to beauty? What do you think the source of beauty might be? And 4, the God question, do you think there might be a master artist behind what we see? Could there be a creator God who is the source of all beauty and who has given us the ability to recognize and enjoy beauty? Then there were some guys who were all jocks at one of our conferences, so they did one on fitness. General question, you obviously, talking to the friend, you obviously look very fit. What kind of workouts do you do? How often? Specific. Was there ever a time when you couldn't work out due to an injury? How did that make you feel about yourself? Issue question. Have you ever found a way of acceptance that isn't based on your performance? God question. As we age and our bodies start falling apart, what difference do you think it would make to know there is a God whose love for us is not based on our performance, our fitness? Right now, I want you to write down the name of the person whom you feel God is leading you to share your life and your faith with. Then I want you to write next to the name, what is that person's real passion, real interest in life?